1 Samuel chapter. We're going to start with chapter 17. 1 Samuel chapter 17. War is never one of those things we enjoy. Unless you're in the military-industrial complex, right? And you get funding from it. But you know the ones who don't like it? The ones that are on the front lines. The Philistines and the Phoenicians. I think it's a mispronunciation in the Hebrew from the Phoenician, Philistine, you know how it crosses over. They were the sea peoples. They came first to Egypt. They went across from Greece, came down to Egypt, and Pharaoh beat them back, and they got back in their boats and got out of there. And we can see this in the record. And then they came, and it was around the time of about 1000 BC when they landed and started. We see this in the times of the Bible when, according 14, 20, 30, where Moses headed from Egypt. You get about 1200 when Deborah, and they were doing their thing. You find in Jericho burn marks, but then you keep going through history. And now, all of a sudden, about the book of Samuel, you start discovering Philistines, and it's right on the edge. In fact, Gaza, you know what we talk about with the press with the Palestinians? Gaza is one of the 5 of the Pentapolis cities of the Philistines. So I think it's Gaza and Ekron and Lachish and Gath and see if I remember the last one. But as you're going through, those were the Pentapolis where the Philistines were. It's right there at the Mediterranean, just south along the Chevalah of Israel. Well, the Philistines saw a beautiful land. They said, we couldn't take Egypt, but we might be able to take Israel. Jerusalem had not been established yet. There were the 10 tribes or the 12 tribes, but 2 of those tribes are in the same area, Levi and also Benjamin. And there's a particular Benjamite, which we're going to be following along with today. Benjamin, from the land of Bethlehem. We've heard of that, haven't we? Bethlehem. Of course, Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but there is a reason why he was born there. For it's the ancestral heritage of King David. The W in Hebrew, the waw, in Europe became a V sound. David. And the battle had begun. In the ancient world, when a war started, it wasn't like, because today, you know, we have kind of like airplanes, we've got missiles. It's a whole different ball game today. But in the ancient world, it kind of, some of the last wars that were like this was World War I, where you do have lines. They would have lines drawn up, and there was the no man's land in the middle. And that's exactly how it was in the valley of Elah, where the Israelites were. In chapter 17 of 1 Samuel, there was a man that came forward, and I'm going to read in verse 4, a champion named Goliath, who was from, where? It's almost like Lord of the Rings, you know, Goliath from Gath, you know, all of that ancient way of talking came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. You know what that is? 6 cubits. Cubit is from here to there, about 16 inches. 16 to 18 inches, depending on how large you are. And a span is from here to here. So you basically have about 9.5, maybe 10 feet tall. This guy apparently was kind of like a gladiator type. He was well known. Isn't it nice when you have someone big on your team? Someone that's good on the team? It's kind of like the Lakers, you know? You can have, I remember back in the days, I came from the 80s, right? Michael Jordan, the Chicago Bulls. I remember seeing one of his first times where he literally jumped from the edge of the key. You know what the key is, the round thing? Okay, the key. Before hitting the key, he jumped and he literally passed over and off he went. I went, whoa, and then boom, it went right, boop, in. I'm like, he got a three-pointer, but he was way too close. He was serious. That was back in the days of Michael Jordan when he was serious. And that guy could really do it. It's great to have someone on your team that knows what they're doing and is good. And Goliath was one of those. The Philistines, the Phoenicians, the Philistines, they had their warrior. They'd worked out a deal among themselves. How about this? We'll battle with you, Israel. We'll battle with you if you bring out one champion just like ours. If Goliath loses, then we lose. All of our area becomes your area. Of course, you know that's really not going to happen. You know that. They'll always say that, and then afterwards they say, try to take our stuff from us, right? That's how it works, and it did happen that way in this. In fact, I'll read right here. His height was 6 cubits, or let's say 10 feet, 9.5 feet. He had a bronze helmet on his head. He wore a coat of scale armor, not mail, scale armor. You know what scale armor is? Little shields that have been put together, locked in, not chainmail. Chainmail, have you ever worn chainmail? That's heavy. It's really cool how it's like a chain. You put it all together. Now imagine if it's little scales, like a fish scale except larger, but made out of bronze. That would be heavy. Man, that guy, he's big and it's heavy. And he wore these bronze greaves on his legs. His armor of bronze was 5,000 shekels, meaning about 125 pounds. Okay? So we're talking some serious weight. And in fact, you get to his javelin, and his javelin in and of itself is about 30 pounds. He's got this, the javelin slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod. The iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. I would want a shield bearer, by the way, because with all this weight, you need to have someone that's like, dude, carry my shield, please, right? But this guy apparently was really strong. In fact, next week we're going to talk about his brothers, because he had 4 of them. And we find them in other places in the Bible. The reason why David finds 5 smooth stones. But let's continue. He was known to the Israelites, in other words. You know, it's kind of like when you have some great wrestler or some great conqueror, and they're on the other team, and you go, oh no. Whether it's basketball or football or whatever it is. You know, in baseball, back in the days of Babe Ruth, back in the 40s, you're like, oh no, he's up to bat. Just throw the ball away from him. It's okay, you can walk him. We don't want him to put the ball way out in the outfield or way up in the stands, right? It's fearful. But this was worse, because if Israel lost, Israel would lose everything. They are fears we have in our lives. Saul was afraid as well. His knees were knocking. You know why? Because just a few chapters earlier, God had told King Saul, Samuel the prophet said to Saul, because you have rejected the Lord has rejected you as king of Israel. So now Saul, or as the word you would say in Hebrew, Shaul, right? Shaul, now he knows that God isn't with him. What's going to happen? In fact, that was the reason why a young man named David had been asked to play for him so that he could calm his spirit as he's fearful. But David was away. Take a look here. So, and let me read here what this guy says. Choose a man and bring him down to me, Goliath says. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him, I will kill him. You will become our own subjects, and you will serve us. Then the Philistine said, this day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man, and let him fight each other. On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and the Israelites were dismayed, and they were terrified. Now David was the son of an Ephraite named Jesse. He was very old. And this is very important because that means Dad couldn't take care of the sheep and the goats in the fields. So even though David was well known by Saul, he couldn't come to battle because the household wouldn't have a business without David. Okay? The business would be gone. And by the way, taking care of sheep is a business. It's kind of like when you're old and you have to man the store, you need someone there. It's like David, send your older brothers, you man the store, because we're going to not have any food to eat next year, right? We need to have food, so take care of them. Jesse's 3 eldest sons had followed Saul to war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second was Abinadab, and the third was Shammah. Verse 14, David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. The valley of Elah is quite a distance. It's up actually in the area of the Samaritans today, or what we'd call not Galilee, but it's more of the north, but more west. Areas where there's lots and lots. It's the valley of Jezreel, that area. Armageddon, the place near where there are the mountains are up and then there's valleys, places for battles. Well, he came. David comes because his dad says, I need to send food. So he had some bread. He had some wheat that had been cooked barley. He also had some cheese. And by the way, this is like ancient culture. Whenever you go somewhere, Anna, when she gives something to the kids like James or John, they'll say, here's some food, but then here, take this for so-and-so and give this as a gift, right? You know how that goes. This is how ancient cultures were. David was given cheese to give to the commander of the army. Tell him we care, right? We want to make sure it's ancient. That's how it goes. You always give a gift. Even if they're going to war, cheese is pretty good even if you're going to war, right? Especially if it's yummy. The curds, that's really, anyway, never mind. Talking about food again, Pastor John. So let's continue on. So he takes it on down, and early in the morning, David left the flock to take care of shepherding and loaded up and sent off. And he had been directed, okay, I'm going to move forward now, verse 25. Now the Israelites had been saying, let me get the bottom part of this. Verse 23. As he was talking to them, as he showed up, he noticed that Goliath starts to speak. Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from the lines and shouted his usual defiance. And David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the men, they fled in great fear. Verse 25. Now the Israelites have been saying, do you see this man? He keeps coming out. He comes out to defy Israel. Notice they're not talking about God. Do you notice that? They're talking about defying, kind of like with America. It was making us look bad. But if you know anything about the Bible, this was about God, not about Israel. Do you understand what I just said? When someone defies the people of God, oftentimes we think about our denomination or us, when in actuality, if we're doing what God, even if we're making mistakes like Saul was, we forget sometimes that it's really about God. Because if there's no more Israel, there's no more Jesus, right? That's going to be born. They had no idea how important they were as a nation to God. They kept forgetting. They only thought about themselves. And this is how we are, aren't we? We worry about us, me, mine, me, I, my income, my I, me, I. We forget about God and His needs for us in our lives. So, he takes it and he's listening to this Goliath. David says, what in the world? In fact, take a look at this. This is Michelangelo. There we go. Michelangelo. We can do it on maybe the screen there. We'll see. Michelangelo. David, the look in his eye, if you look at him, come up here and take a look. He's got his eye and he looks a little upset. He's basically saying, who is this Philistine saying these things against God? And that's what Michelangelo actually had. And he actually has a sling in the larger. He's standing like this. Now, I don't have the whole thing here because I need to put pants on him. But David is here, and he's looking over and says, who is this guy that's talking trash about Israel and God? Who is this guy? David's young. Well, let's take a look here. The fear was through the camp, and there was absolute anger. Or should I say fear? But anger is going to come out. So David starts saying that. Verse 26. David asked the men standing near him, what will be done for the man who kills the Philistines and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this? How do you like this? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Who is this guy? David says. They repeated to him what had been said and what will be done if there was one that kills him. And of course, Saul had said, if someone can beat him, he doesn't have to pay taxes anymore. Actually, Saul said, he'll marry the daughter of Saul, all these different things. Because Saul was a wuss. He needed somebody to do it for him. By the way, if you know anything about Saul, do you know Saul was like Vader, like Anakin? He was like head and shoulders above everyone else. In fact, if you read in the text, Saul was something else when he came in. People are standing and Saul was tall, and yet Saul sits on his throne like Yul Brynner or something, saying, who's going to take care of it? This little guy comes in. David, young guy, should I say, comes in. But read with me in verse 28, and this is the important part as we get to the point of today. Verse 28. When Eliab, his eldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger, and he asked, why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited. Listen to Abinadab. Eliab, I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came only to watch the battle. What in the world does this come from? Let's take a look. Move with me one chapter back. We're going to get to that text that Natalia read. You see, Samuel was looking for a new king once Saul is deposed. Because, remember, Saul had been rejected by God. Do you remember that? So he goes to a place called Bethlehem that God had shown him. And he says, I will show you who this one is. And in fact, Samuel had two things with him. They're called Urim and Thummim. Urim is the white one, because Ur means light. Thummim is the dark one, perfections, Tamid. Urim and Thummim are with him, and it was what the high priest would wear on the shoulders. But he takes it with him to show. He wants to know who God is going to show. This is very important because God chooses, not us. Sometimes we get into the politics, don't we? We see who the eldest brother is. He's a big guy. And God said actually to Samuel, he says, all right, let's move down. Verse 6 of chapter 16 of Samuel. If you go back one, chapter 16, verse 6. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab. You notice the same guy? And Samuel thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. Let's see what God said. Through Urim and Thummim, he showed him. The Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance, his height, for I have rejected him. Now remember, rejected Eliab as king of Israel. He didn't say rejected him as a person. But God chooses. This is one thing about churches and ministry. If it isn't God who calls, then who? Does the conference call me? Well, yeah, sure. Yeah. But actually, I was not ordained by the conference president that ordained me. I was ordained by God. And that conference president saw that the work had been shown that what's happening. So it's not me, it's God. And on the other hand, with Samuel, it's not him, it's God. Because God's the one that calls, and God's the one that ordains, and but we forget that, don't we? We think it's all about us. It's about my might, my power. I am awesome. Dost thou say that you would not like me? No, this is not how it is. God calls. God qualifies. This is why some of the people that God calls, you say, why in the world did God choose that person? Because God is the one that qualifies, not man. He does not see things the way we see them. And we always want it to be about us. Sometimes we use different ways, like age, like size, but maybe we might use other things like color of skin, like ideology. We use all these things in our lives to try to say who's qualified and who isn't, when God needs to be the one that calls. Isn't that true? I'm telling you, God calls all people to be with him. But then when it comes to leaders, God sometimes chooses the ones that nobody thinks about. Why? Let's read. He says, just what Natalia read. The Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at things the way people look at them. People look at the outward appearance. But what? God looks at. And by the way, I said the word God here, but actually in your text it has L-O-R-D, all uppercase. That means Yahweh, personal name of God. If you're Jewish, you would say Hashem. He looks at the inside. Why do you think? He's probably upset because of this. What older brother that's the dude, the guy in the military, really want the kid to be in charge? Of me? No way, man. He says, David, you're conceited. Now, Samuel had anointed David to be king. Boy, and by the way, later on, Saul didn't even know that this had happened. Imagine when Saul does find out. Huh? But God had done something amazing. He had created an event to make sure that David is noticed. Let's go back now to our story as we move through. So, I'm sorry, it's a little later today. Not too much later, I promise. All right, so we continue on. So he just yelled at David, and David says, what, can't I say anything? No, you can't. Shut up and stay in the corner, you little boy. And David's like, he says the same thing. Who's this guy? See that look? Who's this guy? Who is this guy that's saying this about the armies of God? And they said, it's Goliath. He's a big guy. Don't mess with him. Well, he says actually to King Saul. Now, I'm not going to read right here just yet, but keep your finger in it. He says to King Saul, I'll fight him. And Saul is like, And then David says, and we're going to get into this more this next week, but David says, I'll give you a little story. He says, when a bear came and attacked and grabbed one of the lambs, you know what I did? I grabbed him by the beard. Boom! Right here. And I smacked him down. And actually a lion too, which is something else. If you think about it, that's pretty serious. Who here likes to mess with bears? You may say, oh yeah, I like cuddly teddy bears. No, not a teddy bear. I'm talking about the kinds that are hungry and they like lamb. They say it's delicious. They say that goat, ooh, they hear, bah, they go, the lion says, ooh, that sounds like dinner. Right? Lion King comes and, man, he doesn't even have to do this. He said he did it with his hands. He grabbed him by the hair and smacked him down with a rock. He says, I can deal with it. And Saul says, maybe the guy's a scrapper. God's with me. I promise you God's with me. I'll take care of him. Saul, to his credit, Saul actually let him do it, which is a dangerous thing. He's probably thinking, if David loses, I'm going to get all my armies and we're going to have a contingency plan. We're going to just start fighting. That's it. Because we're all lined up, right? I don't know what Saul was thinking. We know that he wasn't a guy you can really trust. But here is now the crux of what Saul does. This is chapter 17. And I'm going to go to verse 37. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. Saul said to David, go, the Lord be with you. 38. Then Saul dressed David. Here, take a look. If you can come in on this. He dresses David in his own thing. Now, when you're up here, you can come take a look. This is from the museum. But he dresses him in his own clothing. And if you want to put that on the, it's hard to do that on the keynote, so we won't worry about it. But he dresses him in his own tunic, and he put a coat of armor on David, right? And a bronze helmet on his head. And if you take a look here, imagine if you're trying to fight like that. It's like, I can't move. The guy says, I can't move. What is this? I'm used to being in the fields. I'm used to doing my job. And Saul's trying to help him out. Saul thinks that if David is more like Saul, he'll win. Do you hear that? Put a helmet on his head. Verse 39, David fastened on his sword over his tunic, and he tried to walk around because he was not used to them. He said, I cannot go in these, he said to Saul, because I'm not used to them. So he took them off. He put a staff in his hand and he chose 5 smooth stones from the brook. How many times in your life have you been told to do things the way everybody around you says is the right way to be done? How many times? You know, when it comes to morality, we want to do things right. That's absolutely true. But you know what? God is a little different than that. I'm going to read, I'm sorry, but I'm going to read for a second, just a little. I know, it always makes somebody upset. Reading a little Ellen White. Listen to this amazing thing from the book Evangelism. This is in pages 98 to 99. In all of God's arrangements, there is nothing more beautiful in his plan of giving men and women a diversity of gifts. Did you hear that? A diversity of gifts. Diversity was not just a 2000 thing, but it was gifts, right? The church, and in the church is his garden, adorned with various trees, plants, and flowers. He does not expect the hyssop to assume the proportions of the cedar, nor the olive tree to reach the height of the stately palm. This is written back in 1870. Many have received but a limited religious and intellectual training. But God has a work for this to do when they labor in humility and in trusting him. From the endless variety of plants and flowers, we may learn and impress an important lesson. Are you listening? All blossoms are not the same in form or color. Some possess healing virtues. Some are fragrant. Others are professing Christians who think it is their duty to make every Christian like themselves. Just like Saul. You see, this was the problem. We all think that we all need to be square pegs, even though the hole that we're supposed to access is round. Maybe, just maybe, God has made you with an ability to do something. Maybe he has called you. It may not be called like to be a pastor. It may not be called to be like David, King David. Maybe it might not be called to be. But God, in his amazing creation, has made you to be a part of his work in some way. Have you ever tried to be something else that you're not? You know, in my early days of ministry, today I do okay with suits. I hated, you know, the one thing I understand, okay, when I was at Temple City Church, I wore sandals all the time. People were like, why can't you wear normal shoes? Because I hate normal shoes. But I learned that no one respected me. They look at me and they go, hi, Pastor John. Hi, Pastor John. So I said, okay, I'm going to wear shoes and I'm going to beat the heck out of them. I'm going to have a great time with these shoes. They better be comfortable. And when they're not comfortable, I'll make them comfortable. But you know, as people, we are told we're supposed to be this way and look that way and do this thing and have that. But you know, God has a plan for you wherever you are. You know, you may not think you're material for God's church, but God planned you, made you, and has a design for you, even if your church may not notice that. It doesn't mean he doesn't have a plan for you. Maybe, and I'm not talking about morals. We want to be moral people because we're called to be like Jesus. But remember, when Jesus was standing there, he was always put down by the Pharisees and Sadducees. While he was doing moral things, he was not liked because of how he did things, because they were more concerned about the outside than the inside. I want you to know that God has formed you, wherever you are, no matter what age you are, young or old, young or kind of young, or young at heart, whatever euphemism you want to say, God has called you to be in his kingdom, to do something. And that means to do something for him. As varied as the flowers are in the garden is how God has called you to be a part of his kingdom. One thing I love about David that this world cannot stand is that he does not worry about the left or the right, how they look at you. And I'm saying left or right today, but back then, there was the same thing. He was more concerned about doing something for God. He wasn't going to wear the armor of King Saul just to make King Saul happy and comfortable. Instead, he decided to go down to the brook, get his sling. This one's made of goat hair from Israel. You put those stones in it, and I'm telling you, these things, have you ever done this before? I'm not going to do it now because I have five smooth stones here. You can really hurt someone and put out a window or put out a person, as we will discover next week. But my message for you is, don't let this world define you. Don't let the church define you. Don't let people around you define you. Define yourself by the Word of God and the morals that he gives us, while at the same time being who you are. Because if you're not who you are, God loses.